Hey, good morning everyone, and as Julia says, it's lovely to see such a big crowd out here in Clonmel this morning. I'm going to be talking about the Irish Civil War and the Big House, and the reason it's mainly about the Civil War period as opposed to the War of Independence is that this is when most of the big houses which were destroyed, which was in 1922 to 23. So I'm going to start with an anecdote. This is the burning of Palmerstown House, Kildare, in January the 29th, 1923. Now, as we'll see later in the talk, this period, the winter of 22-23, particularly January and February 23, is when most of the big houses were destroyed. The reason for this is the big houses, in which almost every case was different, but the reason there was a campaign for burning the big houses was a reprisal for the execution of anti-treaty prisoners. So in this case, 6 anti-treaty IRA men were executed at the Curragh, County Kildare, at the army base. The owner of Palmerstown House is a Free State Senator, Richard Burke, the Earl of Mayo. So despite the fact that his house is in Kildare, he's the Earl of Mayo. It worked like this sometimes. What happened on this occasion was the local IRA in Kildare tried to get in the front entrance, and the servant wouldn't let them in. They managed to get in the servant's entrance around the side, and they confronted the Earl of Mayo, Richard Burke, and he said, "Are you going to shoot me?" And they said, "No, my lord, we are not going to shoot you, but we have orders to burn the building." So they gave him some time, and this is very typical of the burnings, they gave him some time to take some things out of the house. They sprinkled petrol around the house, and they set it alight. Now, it is only right to say, Lord Mayor recalled, that the raiders were excessively polite. Probably something I wouldn't say if someone was burning my house, but there's a couple of things here which I want to flag, okay, which are central to my interpretation of what happened in this period to the big houses. Number one, we see it's a reprisal, and the IRA, anti-treaty IRA volunteers concerned say, we have our orders. So this is my argument. I think it was part of a nationwide campaign. Yes, there were local motives involved in each case, but it's part of a nationwide campaign. The second thing is that generally speaking, it is a campaign against property rather than people. So we have here, Lord Mayo says, "Are you going to shoot me?" And they say, "No, but we're going to burn the house." Generally speaking, people weren't killed in this campaign. Nevertheless, the burning of the big houses left very evocative symbols. So the big house, which is such a symbol in the Irish countryside, going up, burning down is a tremendously powerful symbol. Also, it left these spectacular ruins. So the one here on the left, as we're looking at it, is Moore Hall, County Mayo. The one on the right is Ramsgrange House, County Wexford, so different corners of the country. But let's take a step back. Talk about the place of the big house in early 20th century Ireland. So first of all, I mean, I suspect the reason there's such a big crowd today is the big house itself is a very evocative name, and it also conjures up memories of the big house in the southern states of America and Gone with the Wind and so on. But the big house is a little bit more complicated an idea than it first appears, because on the one hand, it's imagined as the home of the Anglo-Irish, the landed aristocracy, the Protestant descendancy, sometimes they're referred to, the descendants of Cromwell. This is a quote from Irish Freedom, which is an Irish Republican Brotherhood newspaper, and they talk about them in very derogatory terms. Now, this is, of course, in part true. There was people whose descendants were settlers in the 17th century, who had received confiscated land from Cromwell and earlier from Elizabeth and so on. And especially since the 1870s, since the decade of the Land War, Irish nationalists had certainly put this front and centre. So the Anglo-Irish, the landed ascendancy, the rack renters and so on were the enemy. Now, one thing to think about though is that that's not always the case. So first of all, land was bought and sold throughout the 19th century, so the owners were actually a lot more various. Some of them weren't entitled at all, some of them were not members of the aristocracy. And the other thing is, the British system of aristocracy was kind of flexible. So you could be, and this is still true today, of course, in the House of Lords, you could get a title having not been a traditional lord. And two good examples are the Campbell and Guinness families in Dublin. The Campbell family were lawyers. We're going to see they come up in our story later. They were a unionist family, but they were ennobled for their service to the state. The Guinness family, who we're all aware of, were of course business people, but they became barons of Ivy. So they were business people who bought land as like a status symbol and then were given a title. So it's not all the case that they're landlords in the traditional sense. They're making all their money out of rent. The politics of these people, though, is overwhelmingly unionist, and they are disproportionately Protestant, of course. There are exceptions, though. There's exceptions to every case, I suppose, but there are very prominent exceptions. So Parnell, the Irish nationalist leader of the 1870s and 80s and 90s, was, of course, a Protestant from County Wicklow and a landlord, although he didn't have a title. The Childers Barton family, also from County Wicklow, were again ardent nationalists in the period we're talking about. So actually their family going back had been Empire loyalists, the term of the day, but in the period we're talking about, Erskine Childers was involved in the Howth gun running arms into the volunteers in 1914, ended up being executed by the Irish Free State for his opposition to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and his brother Robert Barton was actually a signatory of the treaty, who later turned against it. So both of them were ardent Republicans in the period we're talking about, despite the fact that they come from exactly this Anglo-Irish so-called Protestant landed background. Now, the economic position of this class, if you like, and this is only talking about the landlord aspect of it, but the economic position had really been undermined by the Land Acts. The Land Act started in the 1880s with the Prime Minister Gladstone. I was interested, by the way, to see the main street in Clonmel is Gladstone Street. It's fascinating. I'd love to know the reason for that, but especially since the Windham Act of 1903. The Windham Act was the act under which tenant farmers could buy their land with a subsidy from the British government. And the result of this was, in one way, the biggest revolution we had in Ireland, which was that most tenant farmers came to own their land. So in 1870, before the Land Acts, 97% of the land was owned by landlords and 50% by just 750 families. By 1916, 70% of Irish farmers owned their own land. So this is a massive change, okay? What this means in terms of the landlord class was they keep the big house, of course, they keep the domain lands, the lands that are owned directly by the house, but they lose all the income from the rent-paying tenant farmers. And this basically undermines, if you like, their business plan. They wouldn't have called it that, of course, because the income for their estates in the Great House had always come from the rent, from the tenants. Once you lose this, you get a huge windfall at first because the British government pays market rate, and the tenants have to buy it back from the British government very gradually, is the idea. But Terence Dooley, for example, who is a student of the Big House, makes the point, very few of the landlords used this windfall wisely. Very few of them converted themselves either into commercial farmers or some form of businessmen. Why? Because they'd been used to the old ways. They'd been used to spending the money. They'd been used to showing their riches and their generosity and so on. And very few of them could escape this mentality. So by the period we're talking about, the period of the Irish Revolution, many of the old landed class are actually on the verge of going bankrupt. Some of them, about 30% of them, still hold their land. Most of them do not hold the tenanted land anymore. And while they got this big windfall 20 years before, many of them are in kind of dire financial straits. Now, the political clout of this class, who at one time, of course, has the wealthiest people in Ireland and most influential, had been the dominant political class, was fading because more people basically had the vote. So the vote has extended several times in the 19th century, and in 1919, all men over 21 and women over 30 get the vote. And this really undermines their political position. Secondly, it had been possible in previous generations, even if something was passed in the House of Commons in Westminster, to get it voted down in the House of Lords, where, of course, these people's almost, sometimes literally, but certainly political cousins ruled. Now, this had been taken away in the early 20th century by the Liberal government, and so when the Home Rule Bill was passed in 1912, giving self-government to Ireland, in previous generations, the House of Lords had voted it down. That wasn't possible anymore. So the political clout, certainly, of the southern unionists, the southern landlord class, was really fading by the period we're talking about. Their leader throughout this period was Lord Middleton, who is in the photo here. Now, Lord Middleton, like most people of his background, was against Home Rule. But as things went on, after the 1916 Rising, the 1918 election, when Sinn Féin won the declaration of an Irish Republic and the subsequent War of Independence, Lord Middleton and his allies began to think differently about this. They began to think, what we have to do is try to engineer some solution here where our property and our rights are respected. We have to go for some sort of home rule. So they actually become persuaders for a kind of home rule, and Lord Middleton helped to broker the truce between the Irish Republican forces and the British government in July 1921. So quite different from their northern brethren, if you like, who by that time were concentrating on creating Northern Ireland. So one of the things about the Irish Free State and the Anglo-Irish Treaty was, not in the treaty itself, but in the agreement, in the Constitution, an agreement about the Constitution that the Free State would have, was the idea of the Senate. So we still have a Senate today, but it's the second generation Senate. The first generation Senate was envisaged as kind of a House of Lords. So Middleton and people like him were to be given seats in the Senate. It was supposed to be a representative for Southern Protestants, but more particularly for the landed class. And for this reason, anti-treaty Republicans, people who were against the treaty, saw these people really as the enemy. So not only the traditional enemy, the landed enemy, but also they saw them as, wrongly I think, but they saw them as one of the pillars of the treaty settlement. Now, was there a land question still? This is something you see all the time in writing about this period, that nobody was worried about the land anymore. Now, as I've said, the land was a lot less of an issue because about 70% of the tenants had their land, but that means about 30% didn't. And land ownership, so the buyout of the remaining landlords, is still something that Sinn Féin of those days, the nationalist movement, talked all the time about, and so in fact did their predecessors, the Home Rule Party. The Dáil courts, which was the Republican courts, the illegals courts set up during the War of Independence, were specifically set up at the start to regulate land disturbances. And for example, in April 1922, so this is after the treaty, there's a convention and they hear that there's over 100,000 unpurchased tenants, which is the name for a tenant who's still paying rent to a landlord in the 26 counties in the Irish Free State. What you find across the country, what I've mostly looked at, by the way, is the kind of Cavan Monaghan area, but this is also true in the west and the south. I can't tell you offhand about County Tipperary, but I strongly suspect this is true as well. There's widespread rent strikes, okay, because people think with the treaty, the game is up for the landlords. They're just not going to pay the rent until they're bought out. You see this a lot. You see, in a lot of cases, the actual owner of the land, so generally speaking, it's a titled person, could also be a former member of the military. A lot of them had the title captain and major and stuff. Many of them did not live in Ireland by that point, and the idea is that the tenants go on rent strike, and they're finally going to be bought out. So this is the background. What about the burnings? So one of the things I tried to do in this talk, and this is, by the way, the third generation of this talk. The first one was in South Dublin, and the second one was in Kilkenny. This is the third one, so it has traces of all those talks, by the way. But one of the things I tried to do is I tried to put this in context. It's not the case that the big houses were burned and everything else was left untouched at all. We see the picture here is of Balbriggan, North County Dublin, which is burned by the RIC, the Black and Tans, in September 1920. So house burning is a weapon used by all sides in the Irish Revolution, the War of Independence and the Civil War. Balbriggan is in the picture, but you could also have a picture of Trim, of Tuam, of various other towns, Templemore, for example. There's 37,000 claims for compensation by Crown forces lodged after the War of Independence. So house burning as a reprisal by Crown forces is very common in the War of Independence. The military, the British military, officially blew up with explosives 150 houses from January 1921 onwards in the martial law area. The martial law area is Cork, Kerry, Tipperary, Clare, and I think a bit of Waterford. But in Belfast, which has its own particular type of violence, of course, house burning is very common. What you see there is, a sectarian kind of dynamic, but the worst occurrence is 200 in July 1921 alone, which at the time was known as Belfast Bloody Sunday. So the point I'm making here is house burning is a common tactic at the time. Now, as regards the burning of the big house in the War of Independence by the IRA, there's about 100 of them destroyed in the War of Independence, which is a lot less, as we'll see, than the Civil War, but it's still quite a lot. One of the differences is it's very heavily localised. It's 50 of them, so about half are in County Cork alone. They are destroyed as reprisals, and they are destroyed as potential barracks for Crown forces. So the Crown forces blew up houses of Republican sympathisers, also people in some cases who had just been near an ambush site where British forces had been attacked. And in response, the IRA would typically target a big house. And why did they do this? They also raided it for arms, as I see there. But why did they do this? Why did they target the big house in particular as a reprisal for what the Crown forces were doing? Well, you have to look at, here we go. Oh, sorry, before we, hold on, I think I've missed a slide there. Actually, yeah, I'm going to go back to the Tipperary, for example. You have to look at Republican attitudes towards the big house. So if you read Republican newspapers and so on, even before the War of Independence, and you read the memoirs that they wrote afterwards, they very strongly say that what they're engaged in is what we would now call the decolonization of Ireland, what they called the reconquest of Ireland. And they saw the big house as one of the symbols of conquest. So Tom Barry says in his memoir, Tom Barry, of course, the IRA leader in County Cork, says the symbol of the conquest was destroyed. And he's talking about burning down the house of the Earl of Bandon and the local workhouse. So he says the workhouse is also a symbol of conquest and the degradation of people and so on. Liam Lynch, who in the War of Independence was the head of one of the southern divisions of the IRA, he becomes the anti-treaty leader in the Civil War. He calls the big house and the imperialists, which is what he calls them, the enemy civilian garrison. So they're the enemy, they should be driven out. Sean Moylan, who was another Cork IRA leader, says during the treaty debates, this is in response to the British threat of war should the treaty not be accepted. But Moylan says, if there is to be a war of extermination against us, I might not see its end, but by God, no loyalist in North Cork will see its end. And there is also, you see this a lot in IRA correspondence, there's an idea of imperialists and Freemasons, which is the perception that Ireland was run by underground unionist influence via Freemasonry. Now this sounds like a conspiracy theory, to a degree it is, but it is true, in fact, that many members of the upper class and so on in Ireland, and members of the police and military, were members of the Freemasonry at that time, and they had exclusive clubs in Dublin and so on. But certainly, whatever the truth of that, this is part of the Republican mindset. They very much see the imperialist class, the landed class, the upper class, as the enemy, with exceptions, I assume, like people like Childers and so on, who were in their ranks. But now, so 2 examples from County Tipperary in 1919 to 21. One of them is Lynch Castle. Now, Lynch Castle is one of these castles that had actually been bought out from its landlord. So it's the scene of a lot of landed issues in the 19th century. But by this time, the owner is John O'Mara, who is a corn merchant. So he's kind of the new generation of landowners post the Land Acts, actually, and he's bought the castle itself. But it's burned in June 29th, 1921. It's unoccupied. My guess here is that it's burned because it was a potential barracks for the British Army, which is very common. The other one is Templemore Abbey, which is burned on just before that, 10 days before that, which is the home of Sir John Craven Carden, a baronet and an ex-auxiliary member of the auxiliary division, so part of the auxiliary of the RIC. Now, moving on to the Civil War. The picture, by the way, is O'Connell Street in Dublin in the first week of the Civil War. So, the Civil War breaks out on June 28th, 1922. And of course, most of us are familiar with the basics of it, but it's a war between pro and anti-treaty factions, really, of the Republican movement. So the pro-treaty faction, led by Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith and so on, and the anti-treaty faction, led really by the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, with Eamon de Valera, its political adjunct, I would say, in the background. But as regards the Anglo-Irish class, the landlord class, the titled people and so on, the aristocracy, they're pro-treaty without enthusiasm, generally. They're pro-treaty because this is the least bad solution from their point of view. So remember, the Free State stays within the British Empire under the treaty. There's an oath of fidelity to the king and so on. It turns out that Michael Collins' formula about freedom to achieve freedom was correct, but people didn't necessarily see that at the time. Anti-treaty Republicans viewed this as a negative, but the people we're talking about, the landed class, saw it as a positive, that they were staying within the British Empire. In any case, this class was a target of Republican arms raids from the start. So I said this, one iteration of this talk was in South Dublin, so this is a South Dublin example. Sir Henry Robinson, who had a house in Foxrock, which then, as now, is a very upmarket part of Dublin. His house is raided and there's a gunfight. He surrendered his pistol and 30 rounds. This is very common though. So the IRA goes and they raid the house of the people they think are their enemies. They take their weapons and so on. Some are used as IRA garrisons. So a relatively local example here is Kilkenny Castle, where there's actually a big gunfight in May of 1922. But the summer of 1922 sees the first wave of burnings. Now the picture is actually Limerick barracks in Limerick City rather. But what happens in the opening phase of the Irish Civil War is the anti-treaty side were driven from fixed positions. So they had held various towns across the country, so-called Munster Republic, Dublin, Sligo and elsewhere. They're driven from these by the pro-treaty or the Free State or the National Army in the summer of 1922. And as the anti-treaty forces retreat, they do a great deal of material destruction. So they burn barracks, they burn workhouses, which are barracks-like buildings, they're big stone buildings, and they burn also a few big houses, quite a few big houses, about 30. So the main objective here, as well as revenge, which may have been some sort of an objective, was to deny them as barracks to the Free State forces. So they burned the military and the police barracks, and then they burned the big houses. Now, it has been written by Terence Dooley, who's a great scholar of this, but I disagree with him on this, that there's no military justification for this. I think that there is actually, because many big houses were subsequently indeed used by Free State troops, and these are some examples. So the Glenavy and Drumbo Castle in the County Donegal, Adamson Castle, Westmeath, Markree Castle in Sligo, Avondale House, County Wicklow, and so on. So in this phase, there's about 30 burned as the IRA retreat from their fixed positions. They take to the hills, if you like, and start guerrilla warfare. But on the way, they do a lot of material destruction. They also destroy bridges and railways and roads, and they destroy about 30 big houses. Now in Tipperary, the example here is Kilboy House, Nina, North Tipperary, I realise, but same county at least, which is the property of Henry Pretty. He's the Baron of Denali. Under the Land Acts, he had previously sold most of his estates, so he had 21,000 acres. Now he was down to 2,500 acres. Previously, he had been known to be hostile to the IRA. That he had fired. There had been shots fired on both sides, I believe. There had been raids on his house, but it was unoccupied at the time of the burning. Now, it fits the pattern, to be honest. It's probably burned to deny a barracks to Free State troops, but it's equally possible it's a case of revenge. It is also possible that people burned it because they wanted the remaining 2,500 acres. So in many cases with the burnings, there's probably more than one thing happening. Another example is Tullamaine Castle near Fethard, which is the property of Major Edward Clement Morrell, master of the Foxhounds. It was unoccupied, like many of the houses were when they were burned. Previously, and this is a quote from the National Army or the pro-treaty army, it had been occupied by a large force of irregulars. So irregulars is the term they use for the anti-treatyites. But the IRA left the castle, but they burned it in October 1922. But what really kicks off the Blitz, as some people have put it, on the big houses, which happens in late 22, early 23, is the events in Dublin in December 1922. So the Free State, in an effort to try to end this guerrilla war that was dragging on, had introduced executions of anti-treaty prisoners in September 22. In November, they shot the first batch. They shot 8 prisoners in Dublin, including Erskine Childers, who I referenced before. Now, in reprisal, Liam Lynch, who was the head of the anti-treaty IRA, issues orders that anyone who voted for what he called the murder bill was to be shot. The man here on the left is Sean Hales, TD, from Cork, pro-treaty TD. So he was shot and killed outside the Ormond Hotel in Dublin on December 7th, 1922. But the day afterwards, these 4 people here, who were Republicans captured in the forecourts in Dublin at the very start of the Civil War, so they're senior members of the anti-treaty IRA. You have Liam Mellows, Rory O'Connor, Joe McKelvey, and Dick Barrett were executed by firing squad, so very senior members of the IRA. Now, in the aftermath, Liam Lynch, who was pictured here in his volunteer uniform, issues these reprisal orders. All Free State supporters are traitors and deserve the latter's stark fate. Therefore, their houses must be destroyed at once. So you notice he doesn't say the landed class, he says all Free State supporters. And this is significant because it's not only the landed class that get burnt out. So the widespread destruction dates from this date. As we've seen, there's houses destroyed before this, but in far greater numbers after this. So the Senate is a particular target. And the anti-treaty IRA Adjutant General, Con Maloney, issued the following order. Houses of the members of the Free State Senate, and he puts it in inverted commas because he doesn't recognize the Senate, of course, in the attached forms A and B will be destroyed. From the above date, if any prisoners of war are executed by the enemy, one of the senators will be shot in reprisal. So they made a number of attempts to kill senators. They didn't actually kill any of them. But many senators were indeed members of the landed class. As I've said, this is part of the design of the Free State. So the Blitz on the big house really happens in this period, January to February 1923. So the IRA draws up lists of houses to be destroyed. And this is one of my arguments here, actually. Yes, there's local motives, probably to all the burnings, but the reason they happen is because the people at the top of the anti-treaty IRA orders them to happen. That's my view. So Liam Lynch orders the shooting of senators. And in this case, this is one of the only cases where this happens. He's overruled by Eamon de Valera. Eamon de Valera says, you can't shoot people for things they didn't do, basically, is what he says. Now, as I said, local grievances and land issues are probably a contributing factor, but the political allegiance or perceived political allegiance of the landed class is, I think, the main thing. So these are some examples. These first ones are from the Dublin area because my book, first of all, on the Civil War was in Dublin, and the first version of this talk was in Dublin. But John Bagwell, General Manager of the Great Northern Railway, Imperialist and Freemason, this is IRA language. Henry Wilson, heir to the Marquis of Lansdowne, Imperialist and Freemason. Andrew Jameson, this is of Jameson Whiskey, Chairman of the Bank of Ireland, and Brian Mahan, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces, Imperialist and Freemason. So you see, this is a very common idea among the IRA, rightly or wrongly, Imperialist and Freemason. Brian Mahan, by the way, interestingly, was a Catholic who had risen through the ranks of the British Army, who had commanded a division at Gallipoli in 1915 in the Great War. In North Dublin, the Imperialist Wilkinson, they said they burned his house. They reported burning the house of Major Bromford, a big unionist, and so on, Ferns. And as I said, it includes some Catholics, including Lombard Murphy. You may have heard of William Martin Murphy, who was the owner of the Irish Independent and so on. This is his son. So the Irish Independent was very pro-treaty, and they got burned as well. So there's a blitz on the big houses, but one thing to emphasize though, and I want to drive this point home if I can, there's many small houses destroyed too. So Lynch's order says all Free State supporters are traitors. So this is an example from Dublin. The IRA destroyed 28 civilian homes in this period. 9 of them are big houses of various kinds, and the rest of them are, if you like, small houses. Secondly, the fatal casualties of the burning campaign are mainly pro-treaty nationalist politicians. So Sean McGarry is a TD. Sean McGarry is a veteran of 1916, actually. But his house in Fairview in Dublin was burnt down, and his 7-year-old son, Emmett McGarry, died in the blaze. Kevin O'Higgins, who was the Minister for Home Affairs, a very hardline advocate of executions, but his house in County Laois was burnt down. His father was also shot and killed. W.T. Cosgrave's house, who was what we'd call the Taoiseach, what was called at the time the President, his house in South Dublin was burned down. A relative of his was also killed in his Dublin business. So violence against people is relatively rare, but it's still very traumatic for the victims. Now, returning to the big houses, this is it's a particular story, but this is Baron Glenavy. Baron Glenavy, or James Campbell was his name, had been a leading Southern Unionist. So he'd been against Home Rule. He had sat with Edward Carson on a committee to prevent Home Rule in 1912. By this point, he is one of the people who thinks, like many of them thought, the Free State is much the lesser evil, and he actually becomes the chairman of the Senate. So his house, which was in Kimmage in South Dublin, was attacked. Now this is from his son, and it's very kind of sad because this is in the lead up to Christmas. They come in and they say they're going to burn the house, and the son says, "My train, don't let them burn me train." And his mother says, "Of course they won't." "You," she said, "take out all the parcels and look out for the doll's house, it's fragile." Now, and the mother said, "And leave your silly guns on the table, nobody will touch them." So I like this story, and he plays it for laughs in the memoir. But on the other hand, you know, you have to think about the experience of the family. So they're ordered out into the cold, the parcels are piled, and the house is burned around them. So even where there isn't violence, it's still a traumatic experience, excuse me, for people. Now, turning to the local context, this is a column of anti-treaty IRA fighters or guerrillas from Tipperary. It follows basically the national pattern. So the towns of Tipperary, including Clonmel, fell in the summer in July, August 1922 to pro-treaty forces. But there's very strong, really, guerrilla resistance in both North and South Tipperary, in the silver mines in North Tipperary, based out of mostly the Knockmail Downs, so close to here. In South Tipperary, Dinny Lacey and Dan Breen, the two main anti-treaty commanders here. It's pretty vicious. There's summary executions by both sides. And the formal executions spread to Tipperary in January 1923, where 4 IRA members were executed in Rascrea. Now, more or less coinciding with this, you have big houses burned. Now, not all of these examples are technically in County Tipperary, and I realise the Cappoquin, for example, is in County Waterford, but local examples. So, on the 9th of January, so in and around the same time as the first executions in Tipperary, anti-treaty IRA men burned the house of the Free State Senator, John Philip Bagwell, near Clonmel, and the house, his library is burned down. Cappoquin House, County Waterford, is again the home of senators, Lord and Lady Keane. Craigmore House, again, burned down in February 1923. We have an account actually from the servant Anne Good, and she said it was terrible to see it blazing away. She talks basically, it's the standard story basically. The armed men arrive at night time, they knock at the door, they get let in, they order everybody out, and then they burn the house. The house was unoccupied by its owners at the time, but the servants were there. Rochestown House is burned also in February 1923. The owner is Francis H. Wise. In Kilkenny next door, because as I said, a previous iteration of this talk was in Kilkenny, but there are some interesting examples here as well. First of all, Deesert House, which is the one in the picture here, burned because Ellen Cuff, the Countess, was a senator. Again, the family are absent in England. The furniture actually was not destroyed in the burning, but the IRA came back later when the furniture was being removed and burned it again. It's kind of vindictive. But an interesting and very unusual example is Bessborough House in Piltown, which is because it's unusual because it was destroyed by Free State forces. So it was vacated, again, as many of them were. So many of these families were in England during the time of trouble, but it was being used as a base by an IRA column, and it was burned by Free State troops at night time, pretending it seems they were the IRA. So the government never admitted this publicly, but they did give extremely high compensation, £51,000, which was like a tacit admission of guilt. Now that's the only case I know of where a house was destroyed by Free State forces, but it's still interesting. Again, back to my point though, that the horror, if you like, of house burning is not only something that happened to the big houses and to the landed class. And this is just some random examples. These are mostly taken from army files, which I've looked at in the military archives in Cahill Barracks. So 10th of June 1922, Patrick Farrell is shot dead near Nina because he's the brother of an ex-RIC man, and the house is burned. October 1922, Hugh O'Brien's hay barn, Ballinacurry, was destroyed because he was very friendly with the RIC. So again, this is actually looking back to the previous conflict, even though it's during the Civil War. The 30th of March, this is 1923, 3 men concerned in the Mullahoe burnings were arrested for house burning in Craignamanagh and handed over to the Civic Guard. The Civic Guard is what they called the Gardaí at the time, by the way. April 1923, the house of Culla Walsh family burned. The Curras are diehards, which means anti-treaty, and the object of the outrage is now quite clear. So again, this is actually a burning by pro-treaty forces, it seems, of an anti-treaty Republican family. And finally, the 17th of April, the village hall at Burskane is burned in reprisal for holding a concert there. And this is because while the executions were going on, the IRA had put a ban on public entertainment. They called it the amusements order. So a concert takes place in the village hall here, and the IRA burns it down as reprisal. Now, these are not, of course, big houses, but that's my point. So small house burning probably outnumbered big house burning, but the big house is so much more spectacular that it gets more of the attention. Coming to motivations. So it seems kind of illogical in many ways to target the big house as a reprisal for executions, and it really overestimates the influence of the landed class, the Anglo-Irish class, whatever term you want to use, in the Free State government, because the Free State government at the end of the day is a pro-treaty Republican government. So Liam Lynch's reasoning is that the Free State is a creation of the British, and therefore targeting the imperialists, as he calls them, will result in the British backing down. But this is, of course, a misunderstanding on Lynch's part, because the people he's up against are his own former comrades, and they are the ones who are most determined to bring this to an end. A secondary motivation, though, and this is Lynch's own words, is getting rid of the enemy civilian garrison. Now, this is a factor. So Lynch, as I said, and many other Republicans, sees the landed class, the Anglo-Irish class, the imperialists, as they call them, as the enemy. You burn down their house, you drive them away forever. This is a factor. Agrarianism. Agrarianism means basically the hunger for land. Now, Terence Dooley, who has a new book out on this, and I do recommend the book, but I disagree with him very strongly on this. Terence Dooley says that the house burnings are all about agrarianism. Everybody wants the land, the domain land of the big house, and that's why they're burned down. Now, this, again, may have been a factor in individual cases, but it does not explain, I think, why there is a coordinated campaign of burning that starts very abruptly in December 1922. My argument is it's Liam Lynch and his orders. So it's possible it contributes to it. I don't think it's the reason the burnings happen. The second reason I don't think it's why the burnings happen is the people who are targeted for burning particularly are usually either senators or they were prominent unionists or both. You know, they're imperialists in the IRA's language. So you see, for example, estates, and I'm talking about particularly an estate up in County Cavan, which is owned by a man called Portland. And Portland is, you know, almost a caricature of the absentee landlord. He lives in South Africa, actually, and he's refusing to sell. And the tenants are all on rent strike from the winter of 1921, and yet the house isn't touched. So this would be a prime target for me if they were all about getting the land, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think it's it's the IRA. As I said, the IRA orders, in my opinion, are paramount. Now, they demonstrate, as I said, Liam Lynch's flawed understanding of the pro-treaty mentality. It made no difference, I can tell you, to the pro-treaty government that these houses were being burned down. They grudgingly assigned them an armed guard, but they were low down the scale of people who got armed guards. So the pro-treaty politicians were first, and then very much second were the big houses. Another possible explanation is social revolution. So the picture here is actually from Bury, County Limerick, and the workers are on strike there. And this is from the period. They're saying it's a Soviet and we make bread, not profit. So this was in the air, of course, at the time. But it's certainly not an IRA policy. The IRA is geared towards national independence. Now, there's an episode in late 1922 when Liam Mellows, who, as we've seen, was executed, who was in jail for most of the Civil War up to his execution, gets friendly, actually, with members of the Communist Party in jail in Mountjoy in Dublin. And he approaches Liam Lynch with the social programme. And one of the things that he says is the land should be taken from the big landlords. Now, not only the landlords, but also the ranchers, so the big farmers, as well as the landlords, and given to the landless. And De Valera, for one, who again is the political side of the anti-treaty movement, says, no way. He said, first of all, he said, I'm not interested in mere theories. And secondly, he says, the minute that we put landless farmers on a farm, they will be driven off again by the pro-treaty side or the Free State side, he would have said. So they don't go for this. So this is no part of the IRA's programme, and I don't think they explain the burnings. As I've said, many tenants are on rent strike, but how did the house burnings get them? The people on rent strike know all they have to do is wait for the Free State to buy out the remaining landlords, and they get what they want anyway. Looting has been suggested as a motivation, and there are many cases of looting. So once a big house is burned, many people come from the surrounding countryside and they take what they can. Again, my opinion is this is a result rather than a cause of the burnings. So, moving on, the big house after Irish independence. So, one of the things to stress here is only a minority of the big houses was destroyed. Okay, so Dermot Ferreter in his recent book, Between Two Hells, says 4%. I think that's too low. Terence Dooley says 300 out of 1,500 houses. I think that's actually undercounting the big houses. That's only counting the ones who were titled and landed estates and so on. But going by Dooley's figure, that would be 1/5. Going by Ferreter's figure, 4%. That means the vast majority of big houses survived. Compensation was paid by the Free State, and in my last slide, I'll talk about the compensation paid in County Tipperary. But the big problem for the big house in this period was not so much the revolutionary period, although the early part of 1923 was indeed a very dangerous time to have a big house. The big problem was your estate had become uneconomic. If you had sold up, which most of them had, under the Land Acts, and under the Free State Land Act, which was 1923, the remaining estates were indeed bought up by the state and given to tenant farmers. Your business model, again, was out of luck, out of time and out of luck. You no longer had any of the income that you depended. And the picture here is from near where I'm from, at Farnham in South Dublin. It's of Killickey House, which was owned by Lord Massey. And it's an interesting story. It demonstrates some of this. So Lord Massey's family were a classic landed family in the Dublin Mountains. They were unionists. They had sold their house, they had sold their estate under the Land Act, but they had continued basically to waste the money. So the second but last Lord Massey had a terrible gambling problem, which he was known for locally. And there was actually a number of IRA raids on the house for arms, but they didn't burn it. The house was instead taken off them by the Bank of Ireland. So they couldn't pay their debt anymore in 1923. The Bank of Ireland came and evicted the Lord Massey and his wife, and they went to live in the hunting lodge. The house fell into dereliction and was pulled down in the 1940s. So not everybody has as dramatic a story about this, but the fact is that most of the big houses had become uneconomic. There was no way to pay for their upkeep. And even some of the ones that were rebuilt with compensation after the Civil War fell down afterwards because, again, there was no real way to keep them. So the typical story is many of them fell into disrepair. Many of them were bought up by the religious orders. And this is, I suppose, in some ways symbolic of how Ireland changed. So the old landed class, the Protestant ascendancy, had lost its power. The Catholic Church, of course, became much more powerful in independent Ireland. And many of the big houses became convents and monasteries, and in some cases schools. Later on, many of them were bought as hotels and golf courses. And these are the ones, of course, that remain economically viable today. Now, as regards their political clout, some of them held on in the Senate until 1932. when Eamon de Valera, having come to power after winning that election of that year, abolished the Senate. And that was really the end of their political clout in any sense. But finally, turning to Tipperary. So these are some examples of compensation. So they could apply for loyalist compensation grants from the British government, but to do this, they had to show that the reason their house was burned was for loyalty to the British government. And if this happened before the truce of July 1921, they had some chance. In the Civil War, it's very tricky. So most of the compensation is actually paid by the Free State, the Irish Free State. Many were very dissatisfied, so many they presented a valuation bill to the Free State for compensation, and generally speaking, the Free State paid a lot less than they wanted. So the local examples here, Tullamaine Castle was rebuilt with compensation, was resold several times, and is now a luxury stud, I believe. Lynch Castle, which was actually burned in the War of Independence, £15,000 compensation was awarded, but the castle was later abandoned. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Despite the fact that the compensation was awarded and the house was rebuilt, it was abandoned. Later on, it was taken by the Land Commission, which is, of course, the independent Ireland, the means by which land is redistributed. And in the 1990s, was rebuilt as a hotel. And finally, Kilboy House, Baron Donnelly claimed 75,000 compensation, but he received 17,000. So this is an example of the compensation being way under what the landed people wanted in compensation for their house having been burnt. It was rebuilt on a smaller scale, but the debts were too high, the income too low, and it was demolished in 1948. So this is a good example, I think, of the tragedy in a way of the big house. There was a lot of big houses burned in the Civil War, the War of Independence, but probably this only hastened the end of the big house in Ireland. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take your questions.